And the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered and said to them, "Because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore, I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, 'Hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn so that I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it.'" What were the expectations of the Messiah? The time of the ascendancy of Rome. The people of Judea had high expectations of the Messiah. They expected that when the Messiah would come, that certain things would happen. This idea of what we now call the church age, this time between Jesus' first appearing and his resurrection and his eventual second coming, was inconceivable. Nobody had thought about it. It was not scripture or prophecy, and was not expected. The people who read the scripture expected that the Messiah would end the time of the Gentiles. The time of the Gentiles being this period from the first fall of the Israeli Empire, if you will. Whether you count that as when the Assyrians took away the northern kingdoms, or the final collapse when Babylon took the southern kingdoms. That period of time from then, when there was no longer an ascendant state of Israel, to the eventual restoration of Israel, was considered this interregnum, this intertime between kingdoms of Israel, God's kingdom, being ascendant, and they expected the Messiah to restore them. Well, where did that thought come from? It came in one most important time from Daniel. Daniel was the first prophet of this time of the Gentiles. He was taken away as one of the youth to Babylon, and you all know the various stories of him and his friends. But he, in his first prophetic outing, if you will, he was asked to interpret a dream of Nebuchadnezzar. The dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of this statue. And in Daniel, we read, "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hand, and struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together, and became like chaff in the summer threshing floor. And the wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the first image, the first prophecy that laid out the progression of the time of the Gentiles. And it was pretty clear. Daniel himself went on in that scripture to explain that the head of gold, was Nebuchadnezzar himself. And while Daniel didn't say, it was clear from the historical reading by this time, that is the time of, say, 33 AD, that the empires were Babylon, gold, Persia, with its silver trade, was the silver portion of the statue, that Greece, with its helmets of bronze and shields of bronze, was the empire of bronze, and that Rome, with its swords of iron, were the age of iron. And they would read this scripture and they would see, well, what happens? It's clear also that the stone carved without a hand that then fills the whole earth is the Messiah. And what does the Messiah do? Well, it smashes all of these empires. So, pretty straightforward, pretty understandable. We can see which empire was which. We're now down to the Romans. So the next thing that we expect to have happen is the Romans get smashed, gets blown away by the wind, and the Messiah restores the kingdom of Israel. If you were to ask them, they would probably tell you, well, haven't you read Daniel? Don't you read the scripture? Don't you know that this is how it works, that the true Messiah will bring about the end of the time of the Gentiles? But what was the truth? And what was what they wanted things to be? If you take a close look at that prophecy of Daniel, and you count carefully, there's actually 5 empires, or 5 periods, because it goes from gold to silver to bronze to iron, and then there's this strange mix, iron and clay, where the clay, the Hebrew word that's used here for clay, is really pottery or ceramic, or perhaps you might even say, if you were to put it in our terms, plastic. But the real problem is there's nothing, as I said, there's nothing in Scripture warning of this period between Christ's first coming and second coming. Regardless of whether you count empires and count toes of clay, the point is, through other places in Daniel, that the coming of the Messiah will bring about the restoration of Israel. You could have the Messiah come, or you could have the Messiah not come. You could have the Messiah come, and therefore it be the end of the Gentiles, or you could say the time of the Gentiles is continuing because the Messiah hasn't come yet. To have something where the Messiah comes, but the time of the Gentiles doesn't end, simply did not compute, to put it in the old Lost in Space robot terms. It does not compute. It doesn't make sense. How could that possibly work? Well, the church age, this interregnum period between Christ's first coming and second coming, the best metaphor I can think of to help think about it is if you have ever been to visit Palo Duro Canyon in West Texas. I don't know if any of you have ever been. If you haven't, you really should, because it's an amazing place. You head out, it's out south of Amarillo, and you can get there in a day, and you can eat a wonderful steak at the big Texan restaurant in Amarillo, and then go visit the Palo Duro Canyon. But when you're out there and you're looking, what you see is prairie. As you're getting close, you see more prairie. Prairie, 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 as far as you can see. If you were to prophesy, if you were to say, I'm going to go in this direction and continue in this direction, and I see at the end of the horizon I will see prairie. I'm going to make my prophecy. We're going to run through prairie. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, and you just have to experience it, I guess, out of nowhere, the land opens up and the Grand Canyon appears. It's not quite as deep as the Grand Canyon, but it's effectively, there's no mountain, there's no hill, there's no early drop-off, there's no warning, there's no indication. It's just you see the other side. That is the end, the horizon, the next side, the other side, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, this interregnum, this period, this interruption of prairie comes out of nowhere. And it's fairly large. And you think about it as you get closer, you think, well, why didn't I see this? This is huge. The Comanche tribes hid there for years and ran raids on the settlers, and the Texas Rangers eventually hunted them down, but you can hide there. They have a little train that runs around. You can do camping, many campgrounds, ride horses. It's a large place. But again, if you were coming up to it, you would not see it. Such was this church age. Nobody expected it. However, Christ begins to outline what to expect in it, here beginning in chapter 13. A series of parables, a series of lessons about what it's going to be like. It is the continuation of this time of the Gentiles. And whether we say, all right, well now this church age is that time of the statue, the feet of iron mixed with clay, clay mixed with iron. What Jesus says is the overall message is a series of parables, sowing and reaping. This is where he goes into the parable of the soils. You know, the hard soil and the good soil, and the soil where the plant begins to grow but then dies out. It's the soil where the adversary comes and plants weeds, and then you wait until you harvest them all, and then you get rid of the chaff. Believers and unbelievers. There's this great sifting of humanity, chosen and unchosen, select and unselect. And Christ describes this period now, here, at this moment, to those who would listen, what is going to happen. And that's pretty much what it's been since then. We've had this period, this church age, with all those parables, that time of planting seed and harvesting and so on and so forth, is how it works. This is how it works now. The question, or a question then for us is, so when is the end of the time of the Gentiles? Does the end of the time of the Gentiles correspond to the end of this church age? Some people say that, well, we can see with the reestablishment of the state of Israel, perhaps, that the time of the Gentiles is coming to an end. And perhaps it means that this is the blooming of the fig tree that Jesus talks about. I wonder, having just read in the paper this morning about Iran being given the green light to develop nuclear weapons, that time, if that is the case, that things may get tough for Israel between now and the time of the end of the Gentiles. Christ talks about it in terms of the thief in the night. This is where he talks about the parable of the foolish virgins and the coming of the bridegroom and how it comes all of a sudden. People look to things like the book of Revelation. They say, well, let's read the book of Revelation. That's describing the end times. And there's a TV show we watch. It's called Sleepy Hollow. Sort of a fun little show. I don't know if anybody watches it. But the interesting thing about this television show is the book of Revelation is considered fact. And things happen in the show, and they go look at the book of Revelation and say, oh, this must mean this must mean that. I always find it interesting when the secular media does things like that. there are lots of other places where other references to the end times are described. End of the time of the Gentiles are described. Also in Daniel, in Matthew, Jesus speaks of wars and rumors of wars. I mentioned he talks about the fig tree that blooms. He talks about the abomination of desolation, repeating what Daniel says about the coming abomination of desolation. But really it gets down to, as far as warnings go, Matthew 24:27, when Jesus says, "For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." If you were to put that in physics terms, that's about half a second. It's about how long it would take light to get from one horizon to the other. Not a whole lot of time to get ready. You're going to wait until that moment. He also says in verse 44, "Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." And as I said, if it only is going to be a half a second warning, you don't have a whole lot of warning. But you look at all of this, you look at all these scriptures, and you try to anticipate, and you say, well, should I wait? Should I get ready now? What can you expect? We think, people think, the consensus thinking is, that this church age and the end of the time of the Gentiles, or the time of the Gentiles and the church age, the ending of one will be the ending of the other. They will be coincident. And we think that both of them will occur at the return of Jesus. The expectation is that this church age is the last of the empires of the Gentiles. We expect, based on Revelation, based on Daniel, that things will get bad. In fact, the expectation is that they will get worse than they've ever been before. And if you've ever read anything about the 30 Years' War or read about the Islamic conquest of civilization, things got pretty bad in the past. The tribulations of the Revelation, there's false messiahs. But is our understanding, our expectations any more valid than the Jews of Jesus' time, than those of the Pharisees who thought they knew it all, who thought they were experts in the Scripture, that they were caught up in their knowledge, in their tradition, in their rote learning, in their being able to quote Scripture out of context, that they were ignorant and unable to perceive the miracles that were occurring right there in front of them. So what are we left to do? Well, Thomas Watson used to have a sign that he put up all around IBM, the company IBM. It was a single word on a plaque that he would put up in every office, and that word was think. Think. Consider Nicodemus. Consider Nicodemus, who was a scholar, knowledgeable to Scripture, a leader, someone who could expound and propound and explain and declaim the Scripture. He also saw this dilemma of the Messiah, this binary choice, the Messiah or not the Messiah. The Messiah comes and conquers, or there's no Messiah and the time of the Gentiles continues. So in all his education, in all his knowledge, in all his Scripture study, and in all his interpretation of Scripture, which, by the way, you can't interpret Scripture unless you know Scripture, he still saw and perceived the importance and the meaning of the miracles that Christ was performing. But yet, he couldn't figure it out. If you will, he went through and applied Thomas Watson's advice, think. But in his confusion, his thinking brought him to a conclusion, which was, I will go to the Lord. advice still works today. It is important to understand that Christianity is and always will be a rational thinking philosophy. It is a theology that makes sense. It is meant to be understood and that the pieces fit together. They fit then, they fit now, and they will fit in the future. That's why when you go through Scripture and you pray, an understanding comes that understanding is called truth. As true, and as sure, and as secure as any math proof QED that you might have done in geometry class. God makes sense. Think for yourself. Learn how to fit the pieces together. And understand what you think you know. You often hear me talking about Scripture study. Scripture study and prayer, prayer and Scripture study, and reading. Reading the commentaries, listening to commentators. But do they make sense? You don't have to be a logician. You don't have to know Latin. You don't have to be an expert. But as you study, if you get confused, as did Nicodemus, do what Nicodemus did. Go to the Lord. Go to the Lord and ask. Go to the Lord and ask, both as He is revealed in Scripture and as He reveals Himself to you in prayer. If it can work for a 15-year-old country bumpkin in upstate New York, it can certainly work for you. If you go to the Lord and you ask in sincere desire of understanding, He will answer. Seek the Lord. Ask of the Lord, and He will answer. But most importantly, then, when you have done so and He has answered, be ready to respond